Beginning Chapter 8 of Surprise Kill Vanish by Annie Jacobson. Green Light. It was the fall of 1960, and Billy Waugh stood in the open air, on the inky black sea, near the jackstaff of the nuclear-attack submarine USS Greyback. As the sub slid through the water off the east coast of Okinawa Island in the Pacific, Waugh and 3 team members prepared for a top-secret wet deck launch, a subsurface infiltration technique mastered by a small elite group of U.S. Special Forces operators called a Green Light Team. The training mission was to emplace a tactical nuclear weapon into the target area, arm the device, and exfiltrate without detection. The submarine's motto, De Profundis Futuris, was indicative of these perilous Cold War times. Here now is the last year of the Eisenhower administration. If the United States went to war, the battle cry would likely be nuclear. It was an atomic weapon we were carrying, remembers Waugh, not a mock-up. The Army had us train with an actual nuclear device. We had to be battle ready as we were. The tactical nuclear weapon Waugh and his teammates were carrying was a W-54 Special Atomic Demolition Munition, or SADM, S-A-D-M. It weighed 98 pounds and had a projected yield of between 1 and 7 kilotons. This weapon was designed to be carried on a man's back or chest or in pieces to be assembled on the battlefield. Built by Sandia Laboratory in New Mexico, the portable atomic weapon was capable of entirely destroying an area roughly 1 mile in diameter. Few humans, buildings, or structures in the kill radius would survive, according to material declassified by the Department of Defense. Green Light operators who trained with an actual SADM device, who parachuted with it and swam with it strapped to their bodies, understood the profound responsibility. The blast from a 1-ton kiloton atomic weapon was equivalent to 20,000 pounds of TNT. But as Green Berets, Waugh and the men he was with had been trained to operate under extraordinary pressure, and trusted to handle a device capable of death and destruction on an unimaginable scale, whose power was contained inside a small aluminum vessel the size of a kitchen garbage can. Waugh strapped the components of the heavy and cumbersome nuclear weapon to his chest. As team leader, I carry 2 of the 4 plutonium rings, he remembered in 2016. 2 of the other team members each carried a single ring. The rings were attached to his body with cloth ties and secured with metal clips. Waugh pulled his infrared device for night viewing down over his eyes, scanned the surface of the water, and climbed down off the submarine's stanchion. Skillfully, as trained, he lowered himself into the 15-man rubber boat, RB-15, and assumed position. Were the inflatable boat to strike the jackstaff, it could mean disaster. If the RB-15 flipped, the submarine's powerful propellers would likely suck the Green Light Team members into its wake. But the 4 men on Waugh's team boarded the boat without incident, and the submarine sunk down below the surface and disappeared. We paddled 400 meters to shore. Quiet, silent. No motor, no sound recalls Wah. Once on the shore, the Green Light team deflated the rubber boat, buried it, and covered their tracks with sand and foliage. We walked to the target area. Once we got there, we assembled the device, set the timer for 4 hours, and armed it. It took 2 of us to do it. That was the failsafe. No single team member could arm the nuclear device alone. When it was time to exfiltrate, we started walking out. Use commo to relay our position. The effort to communicate was successful. And finally, the team was picked up by helicopter and taken back to base. To Camp Hardy, says Wah, for a debrief. Camp Hardy was a U.S. military installation on the northeast coast of Okinawa, halfway between the villages of Higashi and Arakawa. That top-secret Green Light team atomic weapons training missions took place here, starting in 1960, has never been officially acknowledged by the Department of Defense. Strategically located 910 miles from Tokyo, Japan, Okinawa had a blood-soaked history. In the spring of 1945, a final showdown between the United States and Japan took place here, the last stepping stone before the mainland. More than 140,000 people died on Okinawa between April and June 1945. In the largest sea-air-land battle of World War II, more than 12,000 Americans were killed and 36,000 wounded. By June 22nd, when the fighting ended, 110,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed and 160,000 Okinawan civilians had been sacrificed by the Japanese army or killed by U.S. military personnel. After the Japanese surrender, Okinawa became a protectorate of the United States, technically no longer part of Japan. The U.S. military constructed bases for its Army, Air Force, and Navy here, including at Naha and Kadena and Torii Station. In 1950, with the outbreak of war on the Korean Peninsula, Okinawa became a strategic foothold for U.S. military and intelligence operations in Asia, a place from which the Army and Navy launched conventional force operations. But the need for unconventional warfare bases was now expanding for classified units like the Green Light teams and others. In June 1957, the U.S. Army activated the 1st Special Forces Group Airborne on Okinawa, tasked with the responsibility for Pacific Theater guerrilla warfare operations. As for Billy Wah, after being singled out for parachute and weapons handling skills back at Fort Bragg, he'd been sent to Okinawa as a member of Company A, 1st Special Forces Group, for live-action SATM training. The role of a Green Light team was to carry a nuclear device into battle behind enemy lines, where it could be used as a tactical weapon. I gotta say, let's just say I'm set. Special Atomic Demolition Munition Training. Special Atomic Demolition Munition Training. Special Atomic Demolition Munition was designed for sabotage, to blow up fortified enemy infrastructure, including tunnels, viaducts, and mountain passes. The small nuclear weapon could also be placed just inside the enemy's front line and detonated there. In addition to killing a significant number of enemy soldiers, a nuclear explosion near the main line of defense could force an army to spend precious resources caring for what would likely be tens of thousands of mortally wounded soldiers, casualties of small-scale atomic warfare. To be selected for a green light team was a rare and private honor. Team members worked under pseudonyms and wore fatigues with no military markings or insignia. The unit was classified, and you didn't go around discussing it or talking about it at the mess hall, says Waugh. Being chosen meant you demonstrated an ability to perform flawlessly, with laser focus under great stress, flexible and rigorous in equal measure. Initial training was at the U.S. Army Engineer Center at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, where Green Light team members learned infiltration techniques, including parachute drops onto land, wet deck launches from subs, and a combination of parachute drops into the ocean accompanied by underwater infiltrations in scuba gear. To parachute a tactical nuclear weapon out of an aircraft required meticulous attention to detail. Timing was everything, remembers Waugh. You all had to jump quickly. You couldn't afford to be spread out when you landed on the ground. The disassembled device was placed into a breakaway bag made of canvas, sealed with a heavy rubber band, and attached to the team's leader's parachute harness. A jumper's rigging was engineered in a way that once out of the aircraft, the nuclear component would fall to the end of the 17-foot lowering line, according to declassified Defense Department material. By separating the munitions from the jumper, the impact shock on water entry would be decreased. It also keeps the weapon from free falling and prevents loss in night missions or heavy seas. But accidents happen, as Waugh recalls. A Green Light crew on Okinawa lost a nuclear device. It slipped out of its harness and fell into the mud on the sea floor. Every asset in the U.S. Navy was involved in finding the missing. I cannot remember this. Special atomic demolition munition. Eventually we found it. These kinds of mishaps are always resolved. The Defense Department has never confirmed the incident. The nuclear weapons work of the top secret Green Light teams on Okinawa was a product of President Eisenhower's limited nuclear war doctrine, officially called the New Look. The concept of a limited nuclear war was a paradox, a seeming contradiction of Eisenhower's military doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Mutually assured destruction presumed that opposing sides would each build an arsenal of nuclear weapons so massive the capability alone would serve as a deterrent or disincentive for ever starting a nuclear war. Neither side would be crazy enough to launch a nuclear strike against the other side. The theory went because all-out nuclear warfare guaranteed complete annihilation of both sides. But what about smaller wars, so-called limited nuclear wars? To satisfy the question, Eisenhower's National Security Council created the New Look Limited War Strategy, which gave birth to thousands of tactical nuclear weapons in the late 1950s and early 1960s, including the Special Atomic Demolition Munition. These small-sized nuclear weapons were designed for actual use on the battlefield, not for deterrence. Nuclear weapons were miniaturized to fit into artillery shells, surface-to-air missiles, air-to-air missiles, short-range missiles, as truck portable weapons, man portable weapons, as atomic landmines, and depth charges. But the very possibility of limited nuclear war presented an obvious problem. It was like asking a dying man to fight with a butter knife when there's an ice pick within reach. The way to deter aggression is for America to be willing and able to respond vigorously at any place and with means of its own choosing, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles told the Council on Foreign Relations in January 1954. In his first public speech promoting the use of strategic nuclear weapons to win small wars directed by Moscow, these atomic munitions could be used in the Arctic and in the tropics, in Asia, the Near East, and in Europe, by sea, by land, and by air, Dulles warned. With this new look doctrine in play, the United States promised it could, and if it wanted to, would, respond to a conventional threat anywhere in the world with a precision nuclear airstrike. But just 4 months after Dulles' 1954 speech, its hollow bluster became clear. In the tiny Southeast Asian country of Vietnam, there, on a small mountain outpost on the Vietnamese border near Laos, a ferociously fought battle came to a brutal climax, stunning the world. The event, now long forgotten by most, was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, a 57-day armed conflict between the communists of North Vietnam and the far more technologically advanced French Union Army and its Air Force. It is one of the most significant unconventional warfare battles of the modern era. At Dien Bien Phu, 42,000 guerrilla fighters, aided by more than 114,000 Vietnamese civilians, put a decisive end to 100 years of French colonial rule. The success of the battle belonged, inarguably, to two men, the group's charismatic leader, Ho Chi Minh, and the general of his army, Vo Nguyen Giap. Just 9 years earlier, during World War II, these two men had been trained by an OSS Special Operations Team to fight Japanese invaders inside Vietnam, called the OSS Deer Team. The unit was the Vietnamese equivalent of the French Jedburghs. In September 1945, Colonel Aaron Bank, leader of one of these teams, spent a day personally driving around Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh after Bank's OSS car broke down. In the modern history of unconventional warfare, General Giap's battle tactics at Dien Bien Phu remain remarkable. In addition to the guerrilla fighters, trained in tactics taught to General Giap by the OSS Deer Team, the 140,000 civilians who showed up proved invaluable to the cause. Men and women of all ages and abilities walked to the remote mountain outpost of Dien Bien Phu from across North Vietnam, transporting supplies and heavy weapons from hundreds of miles away. Among the weapons hauled through the treacherous terrain were roughly 500 American-made howitzers left behind by U.S. forces in Korea and appropriated by the Chinese. To get Dien Bien Phu, General Giap's army of civilian-built roadways and footpaths through deep mud, dense jungle, and mountainous terrain with shovels carried on their backs. Once they reached the battle area, they hand-dug a trench around the 14,000 French forces holding ground there. Ho and Giap's revolutionaries set up their Soviet and Chinese-made anti-aircraft guns they'd pulled up the mountains, using ropes They'd use these gifts of their communist benefactors to fire at French fighter bombers, shooting down scores and making resupply impossible. Entrenched and surrounded, the French lost the ability to fight. On May 7th, 1954, after a nearly 2-month-long siege, French forces surrendered. Some 1,600 French troops were dead, 5,000 wounded, 1,600 missing. Over 8,000 French soldiers were captured by the communists, called Viet Minh, and marched off to prison camps, some as far as 500 miles away. Fewer than half of these POWs survived. In the final days of Dien Bien Phu, the United States did not come to the aid of its ally, France. In the aftermath of the French capitulation, President Eisenhower was forced to consider a new national security challenge that was Vietnam. A delegation of US, French, British, Soviet, and Chinese diplomats met in Switzerland and agreed to divide Vietnam into North and South, as had been done in Korea at the end of World War II. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were given control of the North. Emperor Bao Dai, and a new prime minister named Ngo Dinh Diem were assigned control in the South. The situation was the best the United States could hope for in Vietnam in 1954. In a classified memorandum to the president, CIA Director Allen Dulles relayed a simple truth. The evidence shows that a majority of people in Vietnam supported the Viet Minh rebels, Dulles wrote. The victory in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu has tremendously boosted Ho's popularity, and right behind Ho in popularity was General Giap. In the north, in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh made General Giap his vice premier and defense minister and the commander-in-chief of the Vietnam People's Army. General Giap wrote a handbook on guerrilla warfare, People's War, People's Army, which was aggressively studied within the CIA. Giap shares with Premier Khrushchev a conviction that the future holds many just wars of national liberation. One analysis wrote, Giap's book provided guidance for regular citizens who wanted to join the underground movement and participate in sabotage and subversion against the South. Guerrilla war must multiply, wrote Giap. It was time for the movement to develop into mobile warfare, he commanded, to wear out and annihilate bigger enemy forces and win even greater victories. At the CIA, plans for covert action operations against Ho Chi Minh and General Giap moved to the fore. In an effort to diminish Ho and Giap's rising popularity and to bolster Emperor Bao Dai and Prime Minister Diem, the CIA established a secret presence in Saigon in the south with clandestine offices tucked away inside the U.S. Embassy there. The CIA dispatched a retired Air Force colonel named Edward Lansdale to serve as chief of covert operations. Within weeks of his arrival, Lansdale reported back to D.C., describing the situation in Saigon as chaotic and ungovernable. Bandits and roving gangs controlled the streets. A criminal gang called Bien Duen held power over the riverboats. Animist-based religious sects, including the Hao Hao and the Cao Dai, sold protection against violence and crime in the form of trinkets and magic spells. But Lansdale believed America could work with President Diem. He told his superiors, Diem was an avowed anti-communist and espoused admiration for everything the West represented. Diem dressed like a British dilettante and spoke fluent English, having studied Catholicism at a Mary Knoll seminary in New Jersey for almost a year. He seemed easy enough to control. Using CIA cash, Colonel Lansdale paid off the criminal gangs to cease and desist, then bribed Diem's opposition leaders to step down. In 1955, also with CIA funds, he helped rig an election that got rid of an increasingly unpopular and corrupt emperor, Bao Dai. Lansdale encouraged Diem to unify the disparate groups of people who populated South Vietnam, including the urban elite, the rural peasants, and the tribal hill people. This was what the communists were doing up north, through heavy-handed Soviet-style coercion. But the North was unified, Lansdale told Diem, and without unification, the communists would be more likely to succeed in dividing and conquering the South with their mobile guerrilla warfare plans. Declassified documents from CIA archives indicate Lansdale tried repeatedly to get Prime Minister Diem to unify and strengthen civil society through education and infrastructure programs for people in the South, ones the CIA was ready and willing to pay for. But Diem would have none of it. President Eisenhower had called him the miracle man in Asia during Diem's visit to America, and apparently Diem thought that made him invincible. He was wrong. Lansdale began working on covert actions that did not require Diem's cooperation. Operation Passage to Freedom, disguised as a humanitarian effort by the U.S. Navy, was a covert action operation run by the CIA under the catchy slogan, "God has gone south." The effort drew the world's attention to the plight of religious Vietnamese being persecuted by God-hating communists. With help from the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, the CIA engineered the exodus of 1.25 million Vietnamese Catholics from north to the south. U.S. officials wanted to make sure that as many persons as possible, particularly strong anti-communist Catholics, were located to the south. Lansdale later recalled, "But how to get people to uproot their families and move hundreds of miles?" Lansdale, a master of propaganda, devised a plan. He had CIA artists create pamphlets showing Hanoi with 3 nuclear mushroom clouds superimposed on a map. He infiltrated CIA assets into the north to spread rumors of a possible U.S. nuclear strike against Hanoi. The way to avoid death by nuclear holocaust was to move south. The public remained naive as to Lansdale's efforts, and the campaign that's got to be different. That's got to be a typo. And the campaign was a success, lauded by the international press. But it damaged Ho Chi Minh's reputation as a liberator, at least temporarily. And it infuriated the Politburo, which fired back with a brutal covert action assassination campaign against South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap did not have a powerful navy at their disposal, but what they did have were assassins. Starting in 1959, they began developing an entire mobile warfare army of singleton killers, men and women willing to travel south and assassinate pro-Western South Vietnamese officials, teachers, policemen, and intellectuals. By the time the CIA was wrapping up Operation Passage to Freedom, hundreds of Hanoi assassins had been emplaced below the 17th parallel. Aided by a partisan support network of communist sympathizers in the South. These groups, called Special Activity Cells, were trained by a security operations officer named Nguyen Thai. Nguyen Thai's story did not become public until 1990, after his memoirs were published in Hanoi. He served in the Ministry of Public Security, North Vietnam's espionage and security organization, modeled after the KGB. His father, Nguyen Quang Hoan, was one of Vietnam's most famous authors, says former CIA operators officer Merle L. Prebenow. Thai's rise to power came after he helped the government build a case against his own father for anti-regime statements. To betray one's family in the name of the Communist Party was rewarded as loyalty. In 1959, assassins trained by Nguyen Thai and his security operations officer succeeded in the hit-and-run killings of more than 1,200 South Vietnamese officials. The assassins would run up to a target, point a pistol at the person's head, pull the trigger, and disappear. The ease with which the assassins were able to strike, then vanish, bred paranoia, chaos, and fear. The following year, in 1960, the number of close contact assassinations more than doubled, with upward of 3,500 district officials, rural police, village chiefs, local teachers, and others murdered in the South. This covert war was difficult, dirty, no-holds-barred struggle that employed assassination and terror as its stock in trade, says Prebenow. Eisenhower was in an untenable position. Diplomacy was out of the question, and military action was deemed unwise. The president's third option in South Vietnam, covert action, was having little effect. The president's advisors suggested Eisenhower take action in Vietnam's neighbor to the west, the Kingdom of Laos, where a new communist insurgency was beginning to take hold. These guerrilla fighters, who were allied with Ho Chi Minh's forces in North Vietnam, were called the Pathet Lao. The result was a CIA-led covert action program in Laos, first called Operation Ambidextrous, renamed Operation Hotfoot, and finally known as Operation White Star. The man in charge was Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simmons, a hard-charging, unconventional warfare specialist from World War II operations in the Philippines. CIA officers and U.S. Army Green Berets, disguised as land surveyors with the National Geodetic Survey Association, were sent to Laos to train Royal Laos soldiers in unconventional warfare techniques. The 107th Green Beret, who participated in the operation, were assigned to units called Mobile Training Teams. One of these operators was Billy Waugh. One morning during a, what does that mean again? Special atomic demolition munition training on Okinawa Island, Waugh received his unusual orders. His papers stated that he was going on a 6-month temporary duty assignment, TDY, to Vietnam, when in fact he was going to Laos as a member of Operation White Star. Waugh and a 12-man Special Forces A-team traveled from Okinawa to the Philippines, to Bangkok, and then to Vientiane, Laos. From there, the A-Team took Army vehicles to Pakase, Laos, located in the western part of the country near its border with Thailand. The Green Berets wore civilian clothing and carried Defense Department civilian identification cards. When the White Star team arrived at what would be their training center for the next 6 months, they found nothing but an isolated village of thatched huts. Everything the Green Berets needed to set up training operations was airdropped in from Okinawa. Food, weapons, construction materials, even 2 trucks and a bulldozer. Laos was an impoverished country, living in a pre-industrial age. When Hua first arrived here, the landlocked nation didn't have a single paved road, railroad, or newspaper. Its estimated 2 million people were more likely to identify themselves as Hmong or Miao tribesmen than as citizens of Laos. Most of the White Star trainees were illiterate, and many did not know that Laos was an independent nation or that it possessed a standing army, says Defense Department Command historian Ken Finlayson. White Star advisors faced an almost insurmountable task in trying to instill a sense of urgency and purpose in the Laotian soldier, to implement rigid training schedules, and to prepare them for battle with the Pathet Lao. The intention of White Star was to train Laotian troops to a level of competence that would enable them to fight the communist Pathet Lao. This proved to be a daunting task, if not an impossible one. The Laotian commander of our unit drank a lot and drove his Mercedes around, remembers Hua. The concept of discipline or physical training did not exist. White Star advisor Colonel Alfred Paddock recalled that an astonishing 15 soldiers were killed by their own minds during our stay. How to train a rebel army in the developing world in keeping with U.S. Army standards? The same conundrum has plagued the U.S. Army from World War II to the present day. But there was a far more dangerous problem unfolding, one that neither the CIA nor the Defense Department foresaw. Hanoi was using Laos as a supply route, a way to move weapons, fighters, and supplies from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. This passageway would become known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It consisted of more than 1,500 miles of interconnected pathways and roads, some wide and sturdy enough for trucks, others meant for elephants, foot soldiers, and bicycles. A top-secret national security agency, NSA report declassified in 2007 called the Ho Chi Minh Trail one of the great achievements in military engineering of the 20th century, thanks to the triple canopy jungle that stretched across much of Laos and Vietnam. The construction of the trail was happening right under the CIA's nose. It was a communist-led covert action operation of epic proportions, viciously effective, and so easy to plausibly deny. Historians agree. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a primary factor in America's losing the Vietnam War. And that's it for Chapter 8.